Cynicism is just another form of cowardice. For our sergeant are not interested in a midlife crisis. We were to do our freaking work.
Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 11 of the Spotlight Podcast, Success Stories for Veterans, where it is our job to break down and analyze heavy hitters in both the military and civilian communities to discover their tactics, their mindset, and their systems so that you can take all of those and apply them to your life and your transition. Those heavy hitters range from New York Times bestselling authors to former heads of state to CEOs and other divergent thinkers who dominate their field by challenging conventional wisdom. And today we have with us Kevin Mitchell. And Kevin Mitchell's very interesting because he kind of did things in reverse. He actually got his start as a DA in Georgia, as a district attorney, and then he went to the Air Force JAG after that, where he is now a special victims counsel. And he has a lot of great insight to share with you, so stick around. Or for those people who maybe are not familiar with you, Kevin, give me a little bit of your background. You know, we were talking off the show, you're from Georgia. What was growing up like for Kevin Mitchell?
So it was a really small town. I like to joke there's two red lights in the community, a little town called Ocilla, Georgia. It's about an hour north of Florida and in the central part of the state. So what part of Georgia am I from? South Central. Get a little street cred there. But it was really small. Like, you knew everybody. I know that's kind of a cliche, but everybody knew you. I think that in small towns like that, you have kind of a sense of a community investment in people. So even now, you still have people that follow up with you, or they remember you growing up, or things like that. It's interesting because that particular community has been under the spotlight lately because it's the subject of another podcast that deals with a kind of a cold case murder. So it's gotten a little bit more attention than it probably wants. With that. So, but you know, it was kind of a microcosm. It's one of those things I like to tell people. It's the kind of town where if you were driving too fast, your parents would know because someone would have seen you driving too fast and called to tell them that because they didn't want you to get hurt. So it was like, you'd get mad at this person, but it's like, okay, I get it. I won't speed. But yeah. So
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Everybody knew everybody.
So everybody knew everybody. And what kind of impact do you think that early life in small town, South Central to stoplight kind of town had on your life moving forward past that?
I think what it does is it creates kind of a sense of accountability because you know, I think if you take pride in your work and you take pride in what you do, a lot of that comes down to pride in what you do from a self standpoint, but also you want to impress other people or you don't want to let people down. So I think that when you allow your mindset to kind of grow up in a sense of everything's small, everybody knows who you are, you have a little bit of that pressure. It can be good and it can be bad. We often think of pressure as a bad thing, but it can help you kind of strive to not disappoint people. And so I think you kind of get better at setting goals and at least being cognizant of like, okay, how's this going to look? Because if you fail in a big area or with a lot of people, it may not be as personal. But I think growing up in a smaller community, if you had a failure, you felt like it was a little bit more noticed than if you failed somewhere else. So I think it creates kind of a sense of accountability and a sense of a push or a drive that you wouldn't normally have.
Yeah, you know, I grew up in Oklahoma, and it's kind of the same exact ways that. Almost a little bit of fear in there, a little bit of shaming, but it's the good community presence. So do you think any of that is what drew you to the military?
So I think that a little bit it was a very patriotic community. I think, you know, you have people who celebrate the 4th of July. One of the earliest memories I have from school is being in kindergarten, and that was the first Gulf War. My teacher, her son, I believe, was deployed to Kuwait, but they had a little parade. There's little kindergartners. Everybody was kind of like dressed like a soldier day, walked around and just kind of celebrated the military. I think that you kind of also think that was around the same time that the Whitney Houston national anthem that everybody kind of knows. Yeah. So I think early on you had a sense of this is how it should be. This is something bigger than yourself. This is something that we celebrate. Going into law school, I hadn't actually planned on being a JAG or going into the military. It just kind of went from being a district attorney to wanting to do something to help on a bigger scale for my country. And so I think that the sense of community and the sense of not wanting to let people down, the sense of accountability combined with just wanting to go into public service kind of led me in that direction.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the military component, but I'm fascinated by the decision to ultimately leave a legal career, because you did it in reverse. A lot of people start in the JAG and then move out and go become district attorneys or do something outside of the military. But you decided, you know what, I'm going to go be a district attorney, and after doing that, you moved on. But talk about a little bit about what you're doing currently, so we can talk about that transition.
Absolutely. And so just to kind of back up a little bit, I was an assistant district attorney in a district in North Georgia, the Anoda Judicial Circuit, which is a small 4-county district about an hour north of Atlanta and on the Tennessee and North Carolina border. So if you're picturing that, prosecuted cases ranging from DUIs to murders, worked on everything in between, and I actually went backwards even more so because I went into the reserves first. I was an Air Force reservist because I wanted to maintain my district attorney career, but also kind of do that bigger piece, kind of go into that military service. And then when I went into the Air Force Reserves as a JAG, we go to the same training. So I kind of got a taste of what the opportunity was, and I wanted to deploy, and I wanted to kind of do certain jobs, but then I kind of found out those weren't necessarily open for a reservist. Yeah. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, it makes sense to try to switch over. So, kind of some soul searching, talked to my boss. My boss was very supportive. It was kind of one of those things where he was like, I kind of want to tank your reference that I give him because I want you to stay here. But, he was good, and he knew the bigger picture for me made more sense for that. So I just kind of believed that there was a different way that I could do some good or make an impact that would also help different aspects of life. You mentioned kind of what I'm doing now, Special Victims Counsel in the Air Force. So that program's, still in its early stages, but there's not really a civilian component in the state of Georgia. The prosecutor handles the cases and kind of argues the specific motions that would relate to what the issues that a Special Victims Counsel deals with. But in the military, it's kind of a unique system. So that's kind of where I'm at now. Before that, I was at a base legal office. And as a reservist, I was at a wing headquarters. So there is a different transition there, but it's also a different way to help people who are kind of at a point where something that's probably the most traumatic thing in their life has occurred. And you're able to kind of at least make a difference or try to make a difference, or at least walk them through the process and say, you know what, you're not alone with this. There are resources. I'm here to listen to you. I'm here to advocate on your behalf. And going forward, you at least know that you can, reach out to me to try to help you through this situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's some heavy stuff. And we'll jump back to that, but talk to me about being a district attorney for a moment. And, what does a day in the life of a district attorney look like?
So it was a rural circuit. So if you want to think of any which way methamphetamine can be involved, it kind of had a lot of that in the height of that. And then we switched to pills as a country. We kind of went to the opioids. But as a district attorney, you walk in, you kind of get there early. You kind of, if you don't have any motions or anything that's prepped for that day or any kind of court hearings, you'd kind of take your phone, see what messages you got. Call back law enforcement, see if there was any kind of arrest or any kind of, I don't want to say high-vis issue, but something that requires attention a little bit sooner that happened the night before or at the night shift. Look at your case files. If you don't have a case to prep, you would begin reviewing the case files that you have to make a decision on whether or not to prosecute or whether or not to go forward on a case. Call victims, see what their input is, talk to the arresting officer, see what they thought, if there's anything outside the report. Once you have the report and everything and you make a charging decision, you could also start looking at the criminal history and see if what a reasonable plea offer would be after you talk to those parties. So it kind of is that track when you don't have a court, but if you did have like a motions hearing or an arraignment or a court date for a trial, you would go in and be prepping obviously before that. But then, you'd show up on Monday morning, roll in, grab the trial box, pull your voir dire questions out and start picking a jury. It could be that. You could pick, I think we would sometimes pick 4 juries in a day, a couple of felonies and a misdemeanor, start trying them that afternoon. There was one week where I'd had also, they hate when I say this, but the city I worked in had a night court. And they're like, don't call it night court because everybody thinks of that TV show. But it was, in fact, a traffic court that was held in the evening. So I think there's no other way to call it that. But I had a felony jury trial, and then while the jury was in recess, went and tried some misdemeanor traffic cases and then came back because the jury was still deliberating. So I think that the key, that some of the funnest times I had was as a district attorney. I really loved that work. I had a great boss. I had a great support staff, great paralegal, great investigator, and everyone just wanted to do the right thing. And I think that when you look at those jobs, that really can make or break it, because if you have a team that just wants justice to be done and do the right thing and knows that sometimes doing the right thing might mean a dismissal, or it might mean kind of a alternative disposition or a drug accountability court, and they're supportive of that, that's great, because then you're not so much worried about statistics. I think that somebody told me the worst thing you can do is win your first jury trial. Because after that, you're trying to keep the, you want to win them all. But they say, like, it's best if you lose your first one, because then you're never going to have a perfect record. So you're not going to be afraid to try the hard ones, and you're not going to only try the slam dunk.
Yeah. And how much time a week were you all spending together between the investigators, the paralegals, your other attorneys that you're working with?
Probably 45 to 50 hours. Just it was a pretty, the boss had a really good work-life balance mindset. So, it was kind of like an 8 to 5 job as far as everybody together as the team. We would go to lunch together and stuff. It was very collegial. So that was a good group and a good boss. We were all friends outside of work. So we all just kind of like gelled together as well. But, it did good work-life balance. So I think that's one thing that you really should look for in a civilian, profession. And that's a thing that I think that my colleagues and classmates who were in kind of more of the corporate law did not have that. Granted, there's a payoff difference, but, I think if you feel fulfilled, you kind of need to not necessarily worry about the money so much, more so than what are you truly happy at? What are you making a difference at? For some people, it might be corporate law.
Yeah.
For me, I think it was being an assistant district attorney for the time that I was.
Yeah, and how have those relationships that you developed impacted you moving forward away from that?
Well, everybody was really supportive, but also really sad. I say that because sometimes we have people who leave a job and everyone's like, "We're so sad to see you go," but they're happy to go, but they,
yeah. Like the turd's finally out of the punch bowl.
Exactly. And so we still stay in touch. There's some of my best friends are from that office, and we talk about it. They supported me in the military pursuits. They sent me care packages when I deployed. They Christmas, birthday greetings, all that stuff, checking in. So it's good. And anytime I go back to that area, I visit them as much as I can. So very supportive and understood. I think it goes back to that, you're doing something bigger than yourself. It's not like I left them for more money or I left them for something else. You left them my boss used to joke, he said, "Well, I guess I can't get mad. You left to work for the president and the secretary of defense, not like another DA. So I guess I can't really compete with that." But, it's that kind of thing. I think people that truly have a heart for service, I think, get that if you're leaving to do something similar in the sense of serving a community, whether it's big or small.
Yeah. And how did you broach that conversation with?
So that was funny because in the sense of, it was kind of a situation where like I was about to apply for active duty and they were like, "Well, we need to call your boss and it would really help if he could give some impact. You've been at the DA's office for a while." I was like, let me call him first and let him know I'm doing this so he's not shocked by it. And so we had a conversation about it, but they understood, because one of the things I wanted to do is I really wanted to deploy. I really wanted to kind of work in some areas where you can't necessarily do it as a reservist because it doesn't fit. And they got that. They understood it's not that you just are not happy here. It's just you have to do something different and you're not getting any younger, so you need to do it now. So, I was in my 30s when I went active duty as a JAG. I know that's a little bit older than other people. I kind of joke as like I'm the oldest captain in my age group, but I wouldn't do it any other way. I think it was valuable as far as learning, trial advocacy, trial techniques, as well as some discernment when it comes to how to work cases, how to manage your time, how to prep a case, and kind of what questions to ask. I think that one thing I learned from the DA's office is my paralegals and the support staff were great, because we would walk by and say, "What do you think about this case?" And they'd say, "You don't got it," or "You got it." Talking about what do you think a jury's going to do? And we always kind of forget that as attorneys. We get in this bubble where it's like, "Oh, we know everything. We're attorneys. We're brilliant." And we're not. We're very fallible creatures. And, I think that we lose that a little bit. And especially when you're going in front of a jury of someone's peers, they're not thinking like a lawyer. And it's great to have that perspective in the civilian world of, what does the average person think? And average is not bad in that sense. Average is, what is someone who has not been corrupted by law school and been told that they're a brilliant person who's super special and awesome? Think about the evidence that you have. And I think a lot of successful attorneys in trials, they'll have murder boards. They'll have, where they present cases. They'll have a case kind of dry run in front of a panel of people who are just kind of, from different backgrounds that are not legal, just to see what they think. And I think that's a great strategy to be successful in the legal practice.
Yeah. Staying grounded, I think, is definitely a challenge I've noticed amongst lawyers is, keeping that human element alive, because it's easy to go cold, especially out of necessity. It seems like, and aside from just talking to your colleagues, were there other things that you did to maintain your grip on reality?
So I had one of my best friends was my roommate in law school, and he was not a law student, and he would always half joke, half, I think, needle me about it. But it was one of those things like, yeah, you're going to have your law school friends over. Give it about 15 minutes before y'all delve into talking about nothing but law school. And I think that it's really a challenge for law students because it, consumes so much of your life that you just really stay focused on it. And it's kind of the same thing with the JAG world. Like, you have to have those friends who are not in your career field, because it forces you to not fixate on something, because it's not healthy. I think it's healthy to have friends who come from a different background, who have a different perspective. It makes you a better person. It gives you a different perspective of life. I think you kind of alluded to it, you kind of get in this bubble, but what's the old joke? It's like, I had a t-shirt from, I think it was a Westlaw rep, but it was funny because it said like, it takes, you can't, one of the things that you're a lawyer is when you start losing the ability to empathize with people because you're trying to figure out if they have a cause of action. Because I think our minds get so like, what's wrong with this scenario, instead of just being a human.
Yeah. You focused on solving the problem instead of just having the conversation. So talk to me a little bit about how you balanced the reserves and working at the district attorney's office, because I know that there's a lot of veterans out there who get off of active duty and want to maintain a presence in the reserves, but they run into challenges with their employers. How did you work that out?
So I think, number one, I think it's great that people want to maintain that identity. I have a friend who was in the process of separating from active duty, and then they said, once they found out they got the reserves and put the uniform back on, they felt like they could breathe again. So there is a deep love for the military, I think, with people, and I think it's great to, maintain that presence, and the reserves is a great way to do it. My situation was great. I had a conversation with my boss before I applied for the reserves. He understood that's what I wanted to do. We worked at where I was an individual mobilization augmentee, so it was not the weekend warrior type reservist, but I would go to an active duty base legal office or base facility type job during the week. And so, the state of Georgia was really good about providing kind of paid time off for so many days. I think it's good to check with the policy. I think everybody needs to kind of make sure they're complying with USERRA and some other laws like that. You can always check on that, but they need to make sure you understand what the time commitment is, because I think it's very important to be open and honest and upfront that, hey, I'll have this training and then I'll have these responsibilities. And I think it's just knowing that your employer knows what you want to do and that your employer understands that, hey, there are certain things I have to do that I don't control. Here's what I do control. I'll try to work with you as much as I can. If that's the way you want to go, I find that to be the better way, knowing that you do have some legal protection from several laws out there, or specifically USERRA, that could help you. But you also don't want to be the guy that rolls in and is like, I'm going to file a complaint if you don't work with me on this. You always just want to be upfront and honest. And that's what I was with my boss. It's like, hey, got to go to this school. It's going to be about a month. Then I got to go to a JAG school. It's about 2 months. Then I have to pick my 2 weeks of annual tour, and then I got to go, 16 more days randomly. So it was just, I'll work with you on that. As a trial attorney, it was great because in our circuit, we had a trial calendar. So you could kind of pick like, okay, obviously this is a busy time. To the level that I control my schedule, I need to not schedule something this week or this month. And so it was great coordinating with the reserve side. The Air Force got it. They understood. They were great with that. My supervisor was. And then my civilian supervisor appreciated the fact that I was like, hey, I'm going to still maintain my workload as much as I can. I'm going to make sure I'm here for the trial weeks and the big rocks. And then I'll just move this reserve duty as much as I can.
Gotcha. And that seemingly went very well. So talk to me a little bit more about your time at the DA. And I'm curious, was there ever a time, because I think some people maybe don't realize the actual high stakes that are involved in that type of work. If I quantify this incorrectly, let me know. But you have on one hand somebody who's potentially guilty of something awful getting away with it. And you have on the other hand potentially wrongfully convicting somebody of something that they're not guilty of. Are there any times from your or any situations from your time as a DA where maybe you feel like you failed at something? And how did you recover from that?
So I think the point is you kind of feel like you fail a lot of times. You know, I felt like I failed often at stuff. And I think the way you look at it is, a failure is not fatal. And I think what you do, I don't believe I ever failed at anything that had kind of a huge consequence that negatively affected a third party. That was my big thing, is like, if you have a victim, like, it's one thing to lose a possession case of methamphetamine, they had possession meth, like, okay, I mean, and I had a great drug prosecutor who was a mentor. She's like, look, we're going to get them again. They're hooked on meth. They're going to come back. They're either going to quit. Great. Society wins if they get off drugs, or if they're going to keep doing drugs, they're probably going to get arrested again. So it's going to work out. But I think the way you look at it is better to have, like, I guess going back to it's best to lose your first trial. Have a small failure, learn from it, figure it out, and then go from there. Don't ignore small failures or small lapses in what you think is going to be a successful plan and not learn from it. Because I think a small problem can become a big problem if not addressed very quickly. I made a point to try to always include our victim advocate in everything. I made a point to always try to talk to the victims more than less, because they want their input. Expectation management is also another big key there that I think a lot of people overlook, is what is a likely outcome here? And I think you need to reasonably define failure. I think that what you're really responsible for as a prosecutor, at least in Georgia, the judge sentences people. I'm not in control of sentencing. I present the government's case. When I was a DA, I made sure I had my ducks in a row as far as evidence. I made sure to witness prep. I made sure we didn't have any surprises that I could control. And I made sure to put in the legwork. That's really all I can do. If somebody gets convicted of possession of, distribution of heroin, and the judge gave them 5 years probation when I was asking for 10 years in prison, or I'm making up these numbers. These are not real numbers. But,
there's your legal disclaimer.
Right. The first of many. But when I would... I can't control what somebody sends them to. I can present the case. Yeah. And regarding, I did always worry, like, I don't want to ever convict somebody who doesn't do that. But you have to realize that if you are doing everything as an ethical prosecutor and you're presenting the evidence that was lawfully obtained, going through the motion hearing, making reasonable plea offers, having discussions with defense attorneys. Some of my best friends and the people I work closest with were public defenders. It was a small rural circuit where there was a lot of low-income persons living there. And you would just work with these public defenders. They're not the enemy. They're just the people who are charged with representing people who you're charging with the crime based on your role. So have those conversations with them. What's the sticking point in this plea offer? They never divulged anything they weren't supposed to divulge. They were some of the most ethical people I've ever worked with. But at the same time, it was like, hey, let's talk about what the real problem is here. Let's talk about what the real sticking point. If I have a sticking point, you have a sticking point, that's what a trial's for. If we don't, we can come to an agreement. That's what's best for justice and probably more economical for the taxpayer, then do it. So, but I think when you go back to failures, it's just really learn from the small ones and constantly reevaluate your efforts in how you prepare for a case, and also the expectations. When we would get a new judge, it was like, okay, let's all see what the judge gives on a sentencing for this, and let's see what that, because you don't know. And again, the prosecutor doesn't control what the judge sentences someone to. The prosecutor only controls what information is presented.
Do you have an example of a small failure that you learned from that you thought was pivotal for you?
I've had them, so I'm not trying to be like, oh, I didn't fail anything. I'm trying to think of that. I think the problem is sometimes asking questions. There were times where you just don't think to ask a question and then it comes out, or maybe a defense attorney that you don't know is telling you, hey, you need to check on this. This person's not what they seemed, or something like that. And then you find out the person, might say someone is harassing another individual. And then you find out the conduct was actually kind of mutual. And it's because that witness might not have been interviewed or located soon enough. So it's because you just didn't go out and search or seek or find that person. And that's kind of more of a hypothetical with that. I know that I've seen cases where they always tell you it wasn't something I did, because I had a law school professor who said, never ask the question you don't know the answer for. And I saw a defense attorney in a trial we had where he, thought he was being coy, and he was asking the witness, who is the actual victim in the case. He said, you don't like the way I look, do you? And he goes, nope. He goes, what about my looks do you not like? And what the readers or the listeners would need to know is there was a simultaneous lawsuit at which the defense attorney was suing the victim for the fight that led to his client being the accused. And he goes, the victim goes, you look like a slick-haired defense lawyer who's trying to extort me out of my house. And the jury just lost it. And the defense attorney asked the judge to have an instruction. He was like, you asked the question. No one prompted this. So I think that was a failure I witnessed. A lot of it's just...
That's a pretty big one.
Yeah, and I think one of the failures I would say is don't assume anything. I think lawyers think kind of, we think in large concepts. And clearly somebody would get this, but you never know. And I've had trials before where people get hung up on things that you never anticipated. And all it would have taken was one question like, and did you ask them if they drank bourbon? And they, the cop was like, nope, didn't. And it was like, okay, well, the jury may think that, well, they didn't ask this question, they didn't ask this question. But if the question had been asked or hadn't been asked, go ahead and throw it out there. And then that eliminates kind of a rabbit hole that a jury would go down. So any young prosecutors out there, I would just say, don't be afraid to think outside the box when you're coming up with these questions. It may sound really beneath you, and you may think no one's going to think that, but you just never know what a jury is going to get hung up on. And if somebody misses something or mishears something, they may or may not be following your line of logic and have their own belief of what's going on, and that could result in an acquittal. So,
yeah, man, the stakes. I think the stakes, from the outside looking in, to me at least, the stakes always appear like they're jacked all the way up. And I think it's easy to get lost in that. So tell me a little bit about then the stakes, or what you deal with now as a special victims counsel in this current role.
So a lot of it is, I don't want to say expectations management, but a lot of it is in the sense of just working with somebody who, number one, they're coming to you at a point where they've gone through probably what is considered one of the most traumatic things a person can experience. So, I don't want to assume how everybody reacts to everything, but I venture to say we could all agree that, sexual assault is one of the most terrible things that can happen to a person, no matter who you are, what your background is, whatever. It's consistently one of the worst things. So you're coming to someone who is looking to you for advice. They don't really know what is out there, what the process is. As lawyers, we kind of assume everybody just knows what we do. They don't. So as a special victims counsel, you're not the prosecutor and you're not the defense attorney. You're somebody who advocates on behalf of the victim. You have a separate chain of command. You don't go through the leadership who would be preferring the charges. You don't necessarily have to work with the legal office who are the prosecutors if your client doesn't want that. So you're advocating on a third party who is the victim, who is also the biggest, portion of evidence for the trial usually. And some of it is expectation. It's like, what do you want? I like to ask my clients, 3 questions. And some of it deals with some of the Air Force policies that we have that are specific to the Air Force. But the final one is, what does justice look like to you? And I think that I do that coming from the background of, we're not in a role to initiate a plea offer. We're not the person who does that. That's the prosecutor, that's the government. But I want you to kind of start thinking about, what is justice in this situation? You are the person who knows what happened more than anybody else, who has suffered more than anybody else. What do you think justice is in this situation? And, I think that, you could potentially get a different answer from everybody on the planet. And then, sometimes that's good, because if they say something that is not happening, the U.S. Supreme Court has stated, you cannot have, you don't get the death penalty for a sexual assault. Like it's unconstitutional. So if they're like, the death penalty, like, well, that's not going to happen. Like, unfortunately, that's not an option at all. So let's talk about this more. If it's, I just want an apology, you kind of explain, well, people aren't really going to apologize for that because that's admitting guilt. So there's some other ways to maybe get to what you believe is sufficient enough as an apology. But otherwise, if it's a contested, issue, you're not going to get that. So I think a lot of it is just working with your client to kind of have them navigate the system, know that somebody's there to advocate for them, but really just help them understand what this process is and what is a realistic outcome or what might be a realistic outcome, and then talk to them about what they want to see happen. It may not happen, but number one, I think when these things occur to people, one of the things on top of the physical injury is just the loss of control. I think studies indicate that there's just a constant, like they're losing control. They don't know what's going on. They're having all these questions. They're having all these issues come up. Everybody wants to interview them about the crime. They have these resources. They don't know which one to go to. So a lot of it is like, let's talk about what you think is right and what you want to see happen. And then let's maybe talk about what can happen and then try to see if we can kind of come up with like a battle plan of maybe effectuating some of these things. Or what do you want me to tell the legal office? I can be your go-between. That way they're not bombarding you. So that's, I think, a big part of it.
So you've got this heavy situation, as you pointed out, that is arguably the worst moment of somebody's life in any scenario. And you have to be both professional and empathetic. And as I was reading through your bio, one thing I was struck by is how do you maintain the balance of the seriousness of the job that you're in and being empathetic to that person while still maintaining that professional distance that allows you to do your job, and what does that process look like?
So I think one of the big things that I try to do with every client is when I have conversations, I let them know, like, here's my role, and explain to them that. And that's reaffirming for me, because I think you as a human, you want to help people. But at the same time, I am a legal advocate for someone. So I need to be in that sense of being able to objectively advise them on kind of, let's talk about these things. Let's make sure that you understand, here's what the evidence is. Let's talk about what you want to see happen. But at the same time, here's the process. I can't change the process. And I think it's always highlighting the resources that the Air Force or the military or whatever's out there that is available. And I'll tell, if I get questions about things like, hey, my bottom line response to anyone is make sure you're taking care of yourself. And that may mean not talking to me. That may mean talking to a chaplain, talking to a mental health counselor, talking to a friend, just talking to somebody who can either understand you, help you, or you feel comfortable with within reason. I mean, obviously you kind of get into you switching hats to the lawyer. It's like, obviously don't discuss case details with people that could be called to testify and things like that. But, you have those conversations. But at the same time, there are different organizations with levels of confidentiality that want people to go get help. And so it's making sure they understand those things are out there, making sure they're taking care of themselves, and then let them know, like, hey, give me a call, shoot me a text, whatever you need to do if you have a question. Don't dwell on something for a long period of time that's only going to create more problems for you. Make sure you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah. And that's a lot to manage, just being somebody's advocate. How do you take care of yourself and make sure that you're not falling into your own bad habits through that process, getting too deep in?
So I think it's important also to maintain that, you refer to it back, that, kind of professional distance, in the sense of like separating what your role is and what your role is not. I think it's important to take time for yourself, whether it's a hobby. Again, talking about those friends who are not lawyers, I obviously don't discuss privileged information or cases with people that are not, those that I'm supposed to discuss them with. But it's just making sure you have, like, especially for lawyers, don't just surround yourself with lawyers. Talk to people, have friends who force you to get out of that legalese, track, and make sure that you're, going camping, going hiking, going running, going swimming, doing whatever you do outside to think about other things, family, travel, anything to turn it off. Because at the end of the day, you can dwell on things that you can't change, and you can fixate on something that is not going to be healthy for you to just focus on 100%. And so you have to force yourself to have those distractions. I think a lot of friends of mine who we, are in this career field, it's like, I'm planning a trip to, I don't know, I'm just making it Disney World. Why? Because it's something to do and as a hobby, and you're focusing on a goal. You're going to go to Myrtle Beach, or you're going to go to Alaska or Hawaii. They plan things like that, and it might be 6 months out, and they don't have to plan it that specific, but it's a distraction. Yeah. And it's a goal, and it's something that's not work related. So I think it's important to have those little things. It's important to stay in touch with people and just have kind of a support group to where you see a lot of stuff in this job that just is the worst in humanity. But you have to kind of always have a reminder of the goodness out there. So it's always great to hear about somebody, somebody got engaged, somebody had a baby, somebody got a puppy, just fun things that are great. Somebody got the job they wanted that's, they've been working toward. So it's making sure that you stay positive and that that other things out there are good and are happening to people. And you just kind of break up the work-life balance by that, hard break of I'm going to plan a trip, or I'm going to have a hobby, or I'm going snow skiing, and I'm not going to talk about work, and the work phone is going to be turned off.
What's your go-to de-stressor? What's the one that you always find yourself doing?
So I think that I started going to the gym a lot more in this job, just because it's kind of one of those things you just, you throw on the AirPods or whatever the little things are with the iPhone.
And fancy AirPods.
I know. It took years to get in there, but it's the older one. It's not the new one. So it's just the older model. But something like that, go to the gym, just run. I try to read, keep up with the news, just look at, kind of planning travel, trying to do that kind of in the downtime, see some places I haven't seen before. And then I like to snow ski. So if, there's a pass out there, I'm not going to name it because I don't want to imply it, but there's a pretty good pass out there that if you're active duty military, you can ski a lot for a very low cost. So I think that makes it possible to have kind of an outlet to unwind.
Yeah. You mentioned traveling. Any places that you've traveled that you think everybody should go?
Ooh. So I'm trying to do, when I a PCS, I tried to stop at national parks and things like that. So I'm just big on being outside. So, Washington area, Mount Rainier, I was, PCSing from Colorado. So I stopped at, Dinosaur National Monument, just things like that are kind of unique and outside. I think they're really quick to get to usually, or if they're on the way, do that. Really enjoyed, I went to the Rose Bowl 2 years ago when UGA played in there, and that was phenomenal because, it was just little trips like that where it may turn into something, and don't be afraid to kind of see where you're at and go. Cause we went to the Rose Bowl and we were like, oh, we're going to go to football. And then suddenly everybody's like, Disneyland's right here. So we went to Disneyland, and there's the La Brea Tar Pits and all this stuff. So it was something that started out just going to a football game, but just because you had a little bit of flexibility and realized we're not going to be on such a time set, itinerary that we're just going to go to Disneyland. We're going to go to La Brea Tar Pits, things like that.
I actually went on a vacation with a group of people one time where there was an itinerary, and I wanted to lob myself off the bridge. It's the worst.
It kind of defeats the point of relaxing when you're like, and now we're already behind schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think that sense of wanderlust just to see what unfolds. I know my wife and we went to Leavenworth, and that turned into its own adventure unto itself, and we were only there for 2 days. There's a temptation, at least that I've seen, for people to think like you have to go do this eat, pray, love scenario over in India and have this magical revelation about yourself. But it seems like you're saying the small stuff's what's good.
I think the small stuff's good, and I think you also need to realize that don't be afraid. I think it goes to setting realistic goals. Don't be afraid to leave something that gives you a reason to go back. So if you can't see everything in one trip, just go take another trip.
Yeah.
If it's possible. That's the whole thing of it. You don't have to go everywhere once. You can go back to places a couple of times. So, I think DC's fun. I think, American at Boston, just seeing some kind of, old historic, appreciate the country and kind of the history there. I think, those sites are great. I think that Colorado's awesome if you like snow skiing. Just, anything like that, wherever you are, there's something everywhere that's just fun and unique.
So we were talking before we started recording that you have a lot of friends who do very well for themselves. They make a lot of money, but they are stuck where they're at on a day-to-day basis. What's something that you say no to keep yourself freed up to do the things that are important?
So I think it kind of comes down to, I think impulse buying. I think one of those things is like, we often think of that, like there are very few things that you need on this planet. And so I think that we get kind of like, ooh, it's this. And I see it on sale. Like, do you really need it? What are you going to wear? Like, I have shirts in my closet and suits that I've not worn. And it's because it was like, oh, it was a good deal at the time. Well, a good deal at the time that you don't use is still a waste of money. So I think it's just kind of consolidating down to see what you actually need. And just making yourself kind of cook a little more. I mean, I know eating out's fun, but it's not as healthy for you. And so I've kind of tried to start at least, plan a meal. You save money and you actually eat healthier and you probably feel a little bit better after you do it. So I think that little things like that are big. I mean, obviously, like I'm not like, I'm going to fly to Florida tomorrow for lunch. Like, I don't do that. But I think it's just the small things that really add up. And I think it's just controlling, the debt. I think going to law school is another thing. I went to Georgia State Law, and that was a really, really good bargain. It was a really good school, and I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. But, one of the things with that is you don't really incur as much debt as you do at some of the other law schools. And so I think that, you need to be realistic. If you want to be a district attorney, look for a school with a good trial advocacy program. Don't necessarily look for a school that's super prestigious and expensive, because ultimately you're going to have student loans to pay back. I think that, you have public service student loan forgiveness or public interest student loan forgiveness, that whatever the acronym is, that's great, but that's still a 10-year commitment. If you can, if your goal is to be a public defender or to be a prosecutor, try not to incur a huge amount of debt, because public service salaries are not necessarily the highest, and then you're stuck with student loans. At the same time, if you want to work in corporate law or some of the big law firms and make a lot of money, that's great too. But, it's based on the time you're going to put in for it. So I think you need to look for a healthy work-life balance, but part of that is just managing your debt, especially student loan debt, because that's essentially everybody's second mortgage, and it kind of locks you in and makes some choices for you.
So speaking about the legal career, if you are an ambitious veteran and you're thinking about legal career, what bad advice have you heard, just either about law school or the legal career in general, that you think needs to be cleared up?
You're good at arguing. You should be a lawyer. That's not it. Like, I think that, I think it really comes down to analytical thinking and critical thinking. I think that you need to really, I'm not saying don't become an attorney, and I'm not saying that, but I think you should actually kind of talk to lawyers and see what they do on a day-to-day basis. If you want to be a JAG, go talk to about 4 or 5 JAGs. Don't talk to one JAG, because somebody may have, for whatever reason, something going on in their life that doesn't necessarily equate to what you will want to do, or a good, clear picture of it. I think that talking to a wide variety of people in a profession is great. I think also understanding really what it is. Everyone thinks lawyers just argue for a living. They actually write a lot more than they argue. So if you don't like writing, you probably don't want to be an attorney. But it's a different kind of writing. If you were the best at, English literature essays or papers or whatever you want to call it, that's one thing. But then switching over to, advocating a position on a paper is another. And it's a different style of writing. And a lot of people I went to law school with, myself included, who came from kind of a poli-sci background, was like, I know what you're saying. You just need to say it quicker. Like, stop being flowery. Nobody writes like that. We don't need this. We need it quick, and we need to bottom line up front, get to the point, write a certain way. And it's not, the 30-page essay on, whatever book you read. They want the legal argument broken out in a very specific way. So talk to as many people as possible, and don't just, rest on, you just go argue. That's lawyers just argue. Yes, we are argumentative people, but that's not necessarily success.
Some of the most argumentative people.
Right. And it's a lawyer with a lot of free time is someone who you don't want filing a complaint on you. But at the same time, it's just have a realistic expectation of the job and what the day-to-day work entails. Because, we always kind of joked in the DA's office about, you had a Matlock moment. And that was, that whole thing where something happens in court and everybody goes, and gasp, and the case is won because this person admitted something that nobody had previously admitted. Those are few and far between. And there's a reason that, like, TV shows are entertaining. It's because they're not realistic. And that was one question I'd always ask jurors or prospective jurors was like, how many of you watch Law and Order, CSI, blah, 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 blah. And you just load up whatever the list was of that day. You know, the older people, they would get Matlock. The really old people would get Perry Mason. But the new people were like CSI, whatever. And, you know, and then you'd have to follow up with how many of you understand that's not a realistic portrayal of what's going to happen here today. This is not going to be as entertaining. I don't look like I'm from Hollywood. And we don't have a crime lab that can turn out evidence in 15 minutes. So if you think any of that's true and can't separate that from the reality of this is going to be largely uneventful, let me know now and we can talk about it. So, and that was with the defense attorney and the judge in the room, but, you know, during report hour. But like, you know, you have to ask those questions because it's entertaining. And there was a TV show that portrayed JAGs that if you listened, it got canceled. But
I think I know which one you're talking about.
Right, you do, based on our conversations in your prior service. If you listened, if you opened your window when it was on TV and listened, and the wind was blowing just so slightly, you could hear every JAG in America yelling at that TV because it was so off kilter, and we were all just everyone I know, or so many people I know, were like going on Facebook, like, please talk to someone who knows what they actually do because this is killing us to watch this show. But it got canceled. So America sided with the actual JAGs on that one.
I think they did. So what questions, if you're trying to get a better understanding, you want to go do this survey of legal professionals, what questions would you recommend somebody ask? Maybe the top 3.
I would ask them if they could tell their biggest, like, just, you know, ask somebody, what do you think? Would you do this job? Would you go in this career path knowing now what you know? Would you do it all over again? Yes or no? Why or why not? And if they say yes, would you do anything differently? I think that's one thing. I think people in society nowadays are kind of conditioned not to really ask questions too much. It's not being rude.
Absolutely are.
It's not being rude. And I think you can do it in a tactful way. But I think that you should at least ask, hey, would you do this all over again? I know a lot of people that probably would say no for various things, not necessarily JAG, but just be like, no, probably not. And I know a lot of people are like, yeah, I would, but here's what I would recommend you doing. Learn from my experience and go from there. So I think that's an important question. I think the other thing is do you feel like this is a fulfilling job? Do you feel fulfilled as a person based on your job? Or is this something that you're doing because it frankly pays well? If you had a lower salary, would you still do this? If you didn't have student loan debt, would you do this? Depending on how well you know the person and how open they are. I think those are fair questions. Is this a financial decision, solely, or is it something that you would do if you made less money or if you didn't have student loan debt? So I think that's very important as well, because some people, and it's not a bad thing, might be doing something because of a financial situation.
Yeah. And it's not wrong. And actually, one of the things that a lot of vets don't realize, who I talk to, is people will actually be more open and have those types of conversations with you because they feel like you're a responsible, mature person, and not that they're laying themselves bare for you to interrogate, but they want to give you the real deal. And I've seen if people say, well, I'm just a vet trying to figure this out. I don't know what I don't know. Can you help me out? They'll give you the whole boat a lot of times. So we're getting pretty close to finishing up, Kevin, but I wanted to ask you before we close it up, are there any types of books or resources or anything that you go to that has helped maybe shape your mindset over the years?
That's hard, because now I have to come up with an answer that shows that I read.
It could be a TV show. I don't care. It could be a quote from a song.
Not a TV show. I think one thing that I like history a lot. And so I think that one of the things too is just really, it's going to sound kind of trite, but try to read something that you're going to learn from. I think at least try to balance that out to where you're kind of, growing as an individual, even if it's not anything related to your job. Yeah. Like, look at successful people and don't necessarily go with the self-help, but I think arguably we can make the argument that Winston Churchill was probably one of the most pivotal people and pivotal leaders in the 20th century. Read his biography. We always kind of hear the Abraham Lincoln, basically lost every election except for 2 in his life. So, you hear these stories, but maybe read about other people. I think going back to not being afraid to fail, there are a lot of great people throughout history that failed a lot. Yeah. And they're remembered for their success, but they failed a lot more than they succeeded. And I think it's good to kind of look at, some of these biographies of these great leaders and just learn about the challenges that they had and going from there. I think it's great to just kind of branch out. And if you're a lawyer, read a book about nature, read something that's not related to anything that you do, just to kind of expand that horizon and just be a more well-rounded person. I think if you have, if you're open to, religion or have a faith, I think it's good to kind of, maintain positivity in things. So maybe, some of those types of books, not necessarily daily devotionals, but just motivational things. Because a lot of times, especially if you work in kind of a really, dreary, sad, depressing career field, find something to distract you. I have friends who read the Hunger Game books. So they were adults and they read the books just because they wanted to read something that was a quick read and they didn't have to focus on anything. Granted, I say read, something uplifting, and that's about kids killing each other. but just something off the wall. Just don't be boring. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the biggest trouble with attorneys. If I had to say anything to attorneys, just don't become boring people. Like, you're all talented, you're all critical thinkers. And the same thing goes for, I think vets kind of have, it's interesting because I think there are some stereotypes for veterans out there. And I think it's really, some of them are great, some of them are unfortunate. And I think it's one of those things like, don't allow somebody to stereotype you into something you're not willing to be stereotyped. Yeah. And I think that with the military, I think we can all agree that any large bureaucratic organization has its challenges. And I think veterans need to realize when they're seeking these opportunities, you've navigated probably one of the largest bureaucracies in the world and made it through there. So that there's some, tenacity to that. So don't be afraid to just be able to discuss things like that. The things that most people don't understand about the military. The average person, I think, has very little knowledge of it. But people who are coming out of the military, you can market yourself in a way that really shows that you can function well in the corporate environment or in other environments just because of the normal challenges that you have, overcome in just small things that other people don't really understand, whether it's the patience or whether it's the ability to constantly follow up with things just to make sure they get done. I think society loses that a lot in general, and I think those are, valuable assets that you can really kind of use to market yourself as well in a small way. Obviously, that's not going to get you the job. You have to be qualified, but, it doesn't hurt. Yeah. So.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate the time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks again for listening to another episode of the Spotlight Podcast. And I just wanted to take a second to ask you who you think should be interviewed on the show. Who do you think is out there that's just absolutely crushing it that the veteran population needs to hear from? That's what we want to hear from you. Send us your suggestions to spotlight@thezenveteran.com. That's SPOTLIGHT @thezenveteran.com. Thanks again for listening.